We spend our entire lives trying to avoid hard things. But what if we're actually looking at this all wrong? One man figured this out nearly 2,000 years ago. He was the most powerful man in the world, and he was sitting alone at night, writing in his journal to himself. And in that journal was a single idea that has outlasted his entire empire. And that idea is this: the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And so in this video, I want to break down what that actually means and why I believe that the hardest things that happen to us happen for us. And so the man I was speaking about a minute ago, his name was Marcus Aurelius. And like I mentioned, he was the most powerful man in the world. There was nobody who could tell this guy no. And in his reign for power, he faced so much adversity, from plagues and wars to the death of his children and chronic pain. All of these things that he faced that made it a very tough time while running the biggest empire in the world. This guy was at the top. And so he wrote in this personal journal these ways and these ideas to govern himself in the world, to be a good person, and to stand in the face of adversity. So he created what today is called meditations. And the interesting thing is that this was never supposed to be published. This was just something that he created for himself, which today has become one of the most influential texts in the modern world. And so Marcus Aurelius was a huge proponent to the idea of Stoic philosophy. And I think the core tenet to Stoic philosophy you could summarize in one statement, which is that we don't have control over what happens to us, but we control how we respond to what happens to us. And so the idea is that the majority of people, when something hard happens, when someone passes away, they lose a job, maybe something gets stolen from them, they say, "Why me? Why me, God? Why me, universe? Why do I have to endure this? Why am I having and experiencing bad fortune?" However, the Stoics would look at this another way. They would ask questions around, how can I respond to this? How can I respond to this with virtue, with wisdom, with understanding that I don't have control over these things that are happening to me? So what is the point in me reacting negatively to it? And so the Stoics talked a lot about being in flow with life, with nature, being in harmony with the way of things. And with this, life is gonna life. We don't have control over a lot of the things that happen to us, but we have control over how we respond. And this is kind of like the difference between pain and suffering. Suffering is pain times resistance. We experience pain, but we resist that pain, which is what creates suffering. However, suffering is of the mind. Suffering is of our own creation. And I know it's easier said than done. Things are painful, things happen, things suck. Sometimes it really fucking sucks. However, we still have the agency and the capacity to choose our own way, to choose how we want to respond to the incidents and the situations of life. And this is another core idea that Viktor Frankl spoke about too in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, who is a man who survived the Holocaust. And he said that everything can be taken from a person but one thing, which is the last of the human freedoms. And that is the ability to choose one's own attitude in any given set of circumstances. I might be paraphrasing there a little bit, but that's the idea. We have the ability to choose our attitude to what life throws at us. So with this idea that life is just gonna life, things are just gonna happen, Marcus Aurelius would likely call that fate. The Stoics might call that natural order. I myself typically would just call that God. My belief, potentially contrary to others, is that God places these things, these challenges and adversity in our life, intentionally in front of us so that we have to face them almost like a curriculum. We have to face these things to learn lessons that we could not have learned otherwise if we had not experienced those things. An example of this for me is when I was 19 years old, I got cheated on. And for me, at the time, this was like my version of hell, of like the worst thing that could have possibly ever have happened to me. And so it threw me down a path of personal development, self-inquiry, and really, for the first time, going inwards. I had to look in the mirror and realize that I didn't like the version of myself that was looking back. And so I had to do some hard work, some deep work, some introspective work, and that was so necessary, and I had no idea what it was quietly preparing me for. And my belief is that it was just setting me up. And so for a few years, I dove into personal development, spirituality, and I started to really explore these things for myself. And then my dad suddenly passed away. Out of nowhere. He was healthy. He ended up in the hospital. 2 weeks later, he was dead. It was such a big shock for me, obviously, for my family. And I genuinely believe that if it wasn't for all the work that I had done on myself previously because of that initial breakup that I went through, then I never would have done the work that could have possibly prepared me to be able to handle my father's death the way that I did. And so, obviously, I didn't have to choose that perspective. In fact, it's a lot harder to choose that perspective than just to take on like the victim mentality and just to blame the world, to blame God, to blame fate for my shortcomings and for these challenges that I experienced. But instead, I got to choose otherwise. I get to choose how I respond to these situations. And so I chose to believe that the first obstacle prepared me for the second. And that without that first one, I wouldn't have been able to handle the second one the way that I did. And also without going through the experience of losing my father, then I wouldn't be able to handle just the challenges that I've faced in the past couple of years since. And I wouldn't be on the path that I'm on right now, probably, or at least I'd be in some different place. But I choose to believe that this all is happening for me in the grand scheme of things, in the perspective that's bigger than my own. I get to see that there's a reason behind all of this and that it's not a coincidence the way that it all has worked out. Here's what I've come to believe. So things that challenge us the most are not warnings to stop. They're invitations to lean in. If you're terrified to make content, that means you should probably make content. If you're terrified to go ask that girl out, then you should definitely go ask that girl out. If you're scared to go speak in front of people, then that's exactly what you should do. And the size of the resistance tells you something because it points to your area of greatest growth. By leaning into that thing, that's where we grow the most. And these challenges aren't random. And this is where God comes in for me, because I believe that God places these challenges in our path in order for us to grow into the person that He needs us to be. And so when we face hardship, when we face challenging things, it's like that's time to take the curriculum. That's the time to lean in to see what He has in store for us. Not our will, but His will. What is that hard thing that we're terrified to do, but we need to be doing? Like, for example, I'm sitting here, standing on the beach in Mexico, talking to this camera with everyone walking around and looking at me. This is uncomfortable for me. And if you were to ask me to do this a year ago, I'd be tripping balls right now. I'd be so scared. Not even just the fact that I'm standing here speaking in front, just in public. This in itself is terrifying to me, but also the idea that I'm sitting here talking into this camera that is obviously pretty valuable around a place where this could even potentially put a target on my back. But not thinking about that, just looking at the situation. This is the practice. This is the greatest opportunity for me to grow out of my comfort zone, to step out of my normal way of being and my normal comfort zone and stretch myself a little bit so that this can just be a normal thing that I get to do. That version of you that exists on the other side of that fear, the other side of that insecurity, that is the version that God is calling you to. You don't grow by going around the thing. You grow by going through it. And the moment that you stop avoiding it and you actually lean into it, everything changes. All right, going for a little walk. This is nuts. Let's see if I can drop my camera in the water. All right, made it through, camera is safe. So there's this story of a guy named Thomas Edison, who, if you haven't heard of him, he's actually the guy who invented the light bulb. And there's this famous story where one of his factories actually burnt to the ground overnight. And in the midst of it, Edison could have responded in any way, except he calmly looks at his son. He says, "Go get your mother and tell her to bring all of her friends. They'll never see a fire like this again." I guess there was flames shooting like 100 feet in the air, and they sat there with like popcorn basically and watched this factory go down. And so afterwards they figured out it was over $2 million in damages, which at that time, I believe it was around 80 years ago, maybe 100 years ago, I might be wrong, a lot of money. Yet, in an interview with him, talking about it, they asked him how he felt about it, and he said, "You know what? All of our mistakes are erased. Now we get to start fresh. Now we get to start new. What an opportunity." And so it's like the whole idea that I'm speaking to is he had every right to be upset. He had every right to go on stress leave for a little bit about how misfortune and fate did him wrong, but he didn't. He, in fact, took it the complete opposite way and decided to make the most out of it. What an inspiring story, right? Like, I know these ideas that I'm sharing, you can hear them and it's like, "Oh yeah, Aaron, yeah, I get what you're saying, I get it," but like, when can you actually apply it in life? This is an example of one of the most successful people in history applying it in a situation where most people would crumble. So that quote that I started with, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Marcus Aurelius wrote that in the middle of the night, by himself, in the middle of war and plague. He had every reason to see those obstacles as the end, and still he chose to see them as a way forward. That's the practice. And that is the choice that is available to all of us, to look at our problems and our challenges, not as something to avoid or to get around, but as the exact thing pointing you to who you were supposed to become. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And so if you're sitting here thinking like, okay, I get it, but how do I actually move forward when everything in me doesn't want to? I made a video for exactly that. You can check it out here.